first-person literature as self-recording and self-creation. I'll begin with a few general remarks on the concept of the self. All of us feel we are different than everybody else. We see the world through our own eyes, hear it with our own ears, touch it with our own hands. We have our own thoughts and feelings that we can share with other people. But no one experiences exactly as we do. The multitude of thoughts, feelings, sense impressions, impulses, and actions that make up our day-to-day lives seem to belong to a single someone. We feel that we were this someone in the past and will remain the same someone in the future. We have changed, of course, and will continue to change. But there is something that seems constant through it all. We call this our I, our personal identity, our self. Nothing could be more intimate to us than this self. It is not just close to us, it is all we are. We do not have to look for it. It is right here, or so it seems. But perhaps it's not so simple. For if we try to grasp this self, it is always just out of reach. We see, hear, and touch particular things, but we don't see who is seeing, hear who is hearing, touch who is touching. Ourself, which to our immediate perception is the surest of all things, is at the same time the hardest to pin down. Despite its elusiveness, the self is something we take for granted, and we have a pretty good idea of what we mean when we speak about it. We assume that most adults have similar ideas, though when we talk to people from different cultures, or who were brought up in different circumstances, or belong to the other gender, or are considerably older and younger, we are sometimes surprised to find how odd their ideas of selfhood are. And when we read about people who dwell in different lands or who lived in the different paths, we have reason to wonder whether our idea of the self is the only one possible. We don't know how our earliest human ancestors conceived of themselves, but most of us would agree with French sociologist Marcel Mauss, who said there was never a human being who lacked the sense not just of the body, but also of combined mental and physical individuality. The rudimentary self of our earliest human ancestors survives in us in the feeling that we possess a particular body, our focal points of a particular sense impressions, and initiators of particular actions. Zoologists tell us that some of these traits are present in primates and aquatic animals. Developmental psychologists tell us that they emerge in children at an early age. But neither dolphins nor babies have a developed idea of the self, and it is highly unlikely that prehistoric humans did. Mauss made a distinction between a basic sense of self, of mental and physical individuality, and the idea or concept of the self that humans of various periods have created out of this sense. According to Mauss, this concept developed over time, eventually becoming the conscious self with which we are familiar. This sense of self differs across cultures. American anthropologist Clifford Geertz wrote, "The Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, more or less integrated, motivational and cognitive universe a dynamic center of awareness, emotion, judgment, and action, organized into a distinctive whole and set contrastively both against other wholes, that is, different people, and against a social and natural background, that is, the world around us, is, however incorrigible it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea within the context of the world's cultures. People living in traditional cultures in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Australasia, virtually everywhere except Europe and North America, don't see the self as bounded, unique, and integrated. It would take dozens of pages to give even a summary account of the major differences between the modern Western and traditional non-Western views of selfhood. It is enough for the moment to say that people in traditional cultures give much more importance to social cohesiveness, much less to individual autonomy. In this respect, modern Westerners differ not only from traditional people in the past, from traditional people in the present, but also from people in all known cultures before the European Renaissance. Harvard evolutionary psychologist Joseph Henry highlighted the eccentricity of modern Western cultures by calling them weird, that is, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Most urban cultures of modern Europe and North America are characterized by these five features. So are many of the emerging cultures of Asia, including much of India. You here are not Westerners, of course, but you've been educated in a European language, and your country is increasingly industrialized, rich, and democratic. People who live in weird cultures like to think that theirs is the default human state. But in fact, it is they who are the outliers. Most non-Western cultures and most cultures of the past have had very different preconceptions. We have seen that many sociologists, anthropologists, and psychologists hold that the self is not a fixed quantity. It has a history. You may find it strange to speak of the history of the self. This is because our ideas about the subject are colored by the belief that there is something eternal and immutable in us, that is our essential self. Many religions have a version of this belief. Hinduism speaks of the Atman, Christianity of the soul. Those who follow these and other religions take it for granted that the self is eternal and unchanging. This is a matter of religious belief, and I will not enter into it. But even if we accept the existence of this eternal self, most of us will admit that the concept of the self differs between people of different cultures and different historical periods. To give you some idea of the historical diversity of ideas about the self, I offer a few quotations from well-known Western thinkers. One of the chief attributes of the modern self is inwardness, the feeling that our thoughts and will reside within us and express themselves outwards in the world. According to some historians, early humans, for instance, the warriors depicted in Homer's Iliad, did not have this sense. Its first clear appearance in Western literature is in the works of Augustine of Hippo, a Christian saint who was born in North Africa in 354 AD. Augustine gave classic expression to the idea of the soul in Of the True Religion. He wrote, "Do not go abroad, return within yourself. In the inward man dwells truth." 1100 years later, the French writer Michel de Montaigne wrote in his essays, "Everyone looks in front of him. As for me, I look inside of me." This is similar to what Augustine was saying. But the saint would have been puzzled if he had read Montaigne's next sentence. "I have no business but with myself." To Augustine, the chief business of human beings was to contemplate God. 100 years later, English philosopher John Locke wrote in his essay concerning human understanding, "The understanding is not much unlike a closet wholly shut for light, with only some little openings left to let in external visible resemblances, or ideas of things without. Here, the inner light of the soul is replaced by an inner blank, with openings letting in a little light from outside. An image of the sense impressions which, according to Locke, are our only sources of knowledge." 300 years after Locke, German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in his Genealogy of Morals, "All instincts which are not discharged outwardly turn inwards. This is what I call the internalization of man. With it there now evolves in man what will later be called the soul. Here the inner soul is replaced by an almost biological vital urge." These quotations from several different sorts of prose literature show us that four writers of genius from different periods have had very different ideas about the self. Those of you who have studied literary history, that would include all of you actually, are well aware that people of different historical periods had different ways of thinking and acting. The famous opening sentence of L.P. Hartley's novel, The Go-Between, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there," still rings true. Hartley's protagonist made this observation after coming across a diary he had kept many years earlier. In my own book, Writing the Self, I examine how diaries, memoirs, and other sorts of first-person literature provide glimpses into the way people in different countries and different historical periods viewed themselves. It might seem as if first-person writings, diaries, memoirs, autobiographies, would be among the first forms of literature to emerge. After all, in our daily lives, we habitually express ourselves in the first person. I think this, I want to do that, and so forth. In fact, memoirs and diaries were latecomers among literary genres. The first important memoir in the Western world was Augustine's Confessions, written in 397 to 398 AD. After that, there was a gap of more than 1,000 years before people in Europe began to write personal histories again. In English, the first example was the Book of Marjorie Kemp, written in 1436. The memoir flourished in 17th century England in such works as John Bunyan's Grace Abounding and George Fox's Journal. A century later, the memoir was given a surprising new turn by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his Confessions. Since then, the secular memoir and autobiography have become established forms in the literatures of Europe and the Americas, and more recently, of Africa and Asia. Memoirs, autobiographies, and literary diaries did not emerge in India until modern times, but Indian philosophers have speculated about the nature of the self for thousands of years. I will look briefly at some of their ideas before returning to first-person literature, properly speaking. In India, the sages whose teachings are preserved in the Upanishads developed a philosophical synthesis based upon, but going beyond, the sacrificial religion of the earlier Vedas. The most notable doctrine of the Upanishads is that of the Atman, or individual self, which is one with the universal self, or Brahman. Thinkers in India also developed the idea of the ahankara, or individual ego, a construct that had to be exceeded before one could experience the essential self. Atman and ahankara are important terms in Vedantic philosophy, which was first formulated around 400 BC in the Brahma Sutras. Vedanta was later given various interpretations by commentators such as Shankaracharya, Ramanuja, and Madhva, and later by thinkers such as Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo. For 18 years, Sri Aurobindo kept a diary in which he recorded his spiritual experiences. These included observations about the Atman and Ahankara. The Atman, he wrote in 1914, is myself, as well as the self of all others, friend and enemy, saint and sinner, man, bird and beast, tree and stone, and all things in the manifestation are the forms and activities of myself. Aurobindo defined ahankara, or ego sense, as the illusion which makes each being conceive of itself as an independent personality. This false lower self had to be overcome before a person could become conscious of his or her higher self. In contrast to the Vedantic tradition, which sees the self in each one and in all things, the Buddhist tradition denies there is a self at all. According to Gautama Buddha, there is no permanent self, just a constantly changing flux of consciousness. He told his disciples, all consciousness should be seen as it actually is with proper wisdom. Thus, this is not mine. This I am not. This is not myself. The idea that there is no permanent self proved hard to reconcile with another Buddhist doctrine, the law of karma and the associated idea of rebirth. If there is no self, what is it that bears the burden of karma from life to life? Generations of Buddhist thinkers struggled with this riddle. Some suggested there was a pukkala, or person, distinct from the self, that was a center of agency and responsibility. But this idea did not really catch on. Sufism, a mystical form of Islam, entered India during the 13th century. The development of first-person writing in Islamic literature was everywhere associated with Sufism because, as one scholar explained, central to the Sufi quest for God, was the view that one can only know God if one knows oneself. Two of the children of the Emperor Shah Jahan, famous as the builder of the Taj Mahal, were influenced by Sufism and left first-person accounts of their reflections on the self. Princess Jahanara Begum wrote in her memoir, "This weak woman who hopes for salvation regards no action as nobler than the remembrance of the spiritual states and stations of the revered saints." After entering a shrine and kissing the ground, she achieved a marvelous spiritual state and mystical experience, which cannot rightly be written. Jahanara's brother Dara Shikoh sought spiritual light from many teachers, one of whom was the Hindu sannyasi Baba Bab. The Baba told him that there were 4 types of spiritual leaders, the greatest of which was like a candle, which is capable of illuminating 100,000 candles. "300 years after Dara Shikoh, the Indian intellectual Muhammad Iqbal wrote poems imbued with the teachings of the Sufi mystics. In his famous book, Secrets of the Self, he declared, "I unveiled the mystery of the self and disclosed its wondrous secret. All we see around us," he said, "is an effect of the self." First-person literature in English took off in the 16th century as a side effect of the Protestant Reformation. Unlike Catholicism, which relies on the intercession of priests, Protestant denominations insisted that the Bible alone provided divine guidance. Catholics were able to gain absolution through confession. Protestants, who rejected priestly mediation, turned to diaries to help them in the task of self-examination. Janet Hamilton, a 17th century Englishwoman, addressed God directly in her diary. "Lord, thou knowest my former engagements, which passed betwixt my soul and thee, when I entered into covenant with thee to my soul's great comfort, in the sweet castle of gladness, I giving myself up unto thee, and to our noble work of reformation." Protestant self-inquiry often led to inner anguish. Early entries in the diary of Samuel Ward, a preacher remembered mainly as one of the translators of the King James Bible, consist almost entirely of lists of sins. For example, "Mine idleness in not rising to prayers, my little care of God in the morning and thinking on him, my desire of vainglory, my careless hearing of Mr. Newhouse's catechizing," and later, "my forgetfulness in noting my sins." It's easy to see that this sort of negative self-absorption could soon become exhausting. In England, the excesses of Puritanism reached their peak during the Commonwealth and declined rapidly after the restoration of Charles II. Most people were glad to see the last of the Puritans and their holier-than-thou posturing, but a number of them took the diary, which for the Protestants was an instrument of religion, and put it to secular use. Samuel Pepys, a young government servant and man about town, recorded his impressions of swinging London of the mid-17th century. After seeing a play featuring Nell Gwynn, the celebrated actress and mistress of the king, he wrote, "So great performance of a comical part was never, I believe, in the world before Nell's presentation." When later he saw her standing outside her room in her smock sleeves and bodice, looking upon one, he had to admit she seemed a mighty pretty creature. Clearly, we are in a different world here than that of the Reverend Samuel Ward. Pepys' diary, generally considered the greatest example of the genre in English, is an important source for historians of the period, containing first-hand accounts of many important events, such as the Great Fire of 1666. He also recorded his reflections on his inner states. After returning from a Sunday visit to a nobleman, he wrote with remarkable candor, "I consider the manner of my going hither, with a coach and 4 horses, and servants, and a woman with us, and coming hither being so much made of, and used with that state, and then going to Windsor and being shown all that we were there, and had wherewith to give everybody something for their pains, and then going home, and all in fine weather, and no fears nor cares upon me, I do think myself obliged to feel myself happy." This is quite a different sort of self-examination than that of Janet Hamilton. Now we will turn to English literature of the 18th and 19th century, literature that most of you will be familiar with. Critics generally regard Samuel Richardson's Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, published in 1740, as the first true novel in English. The author followed up his success with Clarissa, published 7 years later. Both novels are presented in the form of letters in which, as Richardson explained in the preface to Clarissa, the hearts of the writers of the letters must be supposed to be wholly engaged in their subjects, so that they abound not only with critical situations, but with what may be called instantaneous descriptions and reflections. By allowing his characters to reveal their thoughts and motives in their own unguarded words, Richardson helped his readers delve into the minds of others, observing men and women in the process of self-formation. All Richardson's characters are remarkably self-aware. When the servant girl Pamela seeks to ward off the attentions of the dissolute suitor, who pretends to mistake her for her sister, she declares, "Oh, sir, I am Pamela. Indeed, I am Pamela, her own self." Carried off to his country estate, she contemplates suicide, but then remembers the teachings of the church. Stepping back from the brink, she thanks God that she has been delivered from a worse enemy, myself. By the end of the 18th century, the practice of keeping diaries was widespread in British society, so much so that it found its way into fiction. Lemuel Gulliver had a notebook in his pocket when he landed on Lilliput. Robinson Crusoe kept a diary until he ran out of ink. Crusoe's creator, Daniel Defoe, published a fictionalized Journal of the Plague Year in 1722. 55 years later, the first diary novel appeared. It has remained a popular subgenre ever since. Actual people who kept diaries during this 18th century included preachers, lawyers, merchants, soldiers, sailors, doctors, and a good number of writers. 22-year-old James Boswell, filled with an ardent desire for literary fame, started a journal just before he left Scotland for London in 1762. Boswell was an amateur psychologist who treated himself as his own chief subject. His account of a secret assignation with an actress was honest, insightful, and hilarious. He headed a little speculation on the human mind. For here was I, a young man full of vigor and vivacity, the favorite lover of a handsome actress, and going to enjoy the full possession of my warmest wishes, and yet melancholy threw a cloud over my mind. Later, I then barred the door of her dining room, led her all fluttering into her bedchamber, and was making a triumphal entry when we heard her landlady coming up. Boswell is, of course, best known for his biography of Samuel Johnson, which captures the character of the critic and poet by carefully recording his words and actions without trying to paper over his oddities. English literary romanticism is usually said to date from the publication of lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1798. It reached a culmination in Wordsworth's autobiographical poem, The Prelude. In this enormous work, he sketched the defining incidents of his inner life, moments known only to him that made him what he was. In one passage, Wordsworth addressed the wisdom and spirit of the universe. Thou soul that art the eternity of thought, that givest to forms and images a breath and everlasting motion, not in vain by day or night or starlight, thus from my first dawn of childhood, didst thou intertwine for me the passions that build up our human soul. The Prelude is the supreme autobiographical poem in English, and also the first great example of the narrative of Bildung, or self-cultivation. Other examples soon followed. Before long, every significant work of literature was, as critic Susan Sontag put it, a first-person performance. In America, the transformation of the diary and memoir from instruments of religion to records of secular life took a course similar to that in England. Jonathan Edwards was one of the leading preachers of 18th century New England. In a memoir known as The Personal Narrative, he wrote of his conversion from a life of sin. A period of childhood innocence was followed by a fall. I entirely lost all those affections and delights, and returned like a dog to his vomit, and went on in the ways of sin. But Edwards also was sensitive to the manifold beauties of the world. Walking alone in the countryside, he, quote, found from time to time an inner sweetness that used, as it were, to carry me away in my contemplation. A century later, another New England preacher, Ralph Waldo Emerson, began a diary while a divinity student at Harvard. In April 1824, under the heading Myself, he undertook a written self-examination similar to those of his Puritan ancestors. He found he lacked the good-humored independence and self-esteem which should mark the gentleman. This unfitted him for the professions of law or medicine, but, he wrote, in divinity, I hope to thrive. My understanding venerates and my heart loves that cause which is dear to God and man. Intellectually curious, Emerson allowed his mind to graze in pastures unknown to the average divinity student. Looking at the literature of the early 19th century, he noted that the present age is said to be the age of the first person singular. We find in Emerson's diaries an original conception of the spiritual individual, founded on inner experience. In one journal entry he wrote, a certain wandering light comes to me, which I instantly perceive to be the cause of causes. It transcends all proving. It is itself the ground of being, and I see that it is not one, and I another, but this is the life of my life. Such inner experiences were the basis of Emerson's personal religion. Emerson's younger contemporary friend, Henry David Thoreau, took up diary writing at Emerson's suggestion. Renowned as a nature writer, Thoreau excelled both in description and evocation. Long passages of his diary are given over to scientific descriptions of rocks, leaves, and insects. But in other places, the poet took over. The river is silvery, as it were plated and polished smooth, with the slightest possible tinge of gold tonight. How beautiful the meanders of a river thus revealed. How beautiful hills and vales, the whole surface of the earth, a succession of these great cups falling away from dry or rocky edges to gelid green meadows and water in the midst, where night already is setting in. The greatest first-person poet of the 19th century America undoubtedly was Walt Whitman. His incomparable Song of Myself begins, "One self I sing, a simple, separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse." The two lines must be read together. Whitman's boundless fascination with himself was balanced by an equally boundless fascination with the selves of others. And there was no radical difference between them. As he told his readers, every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. In 1841, after reading a disappointing work of fiction, Emerson wrote in his journal, "These novels will give way by and by to diaries or autobiographies, captivating books, if only a man knew how to choose among what he calls his experiences. Choose among what he calls his experiences, that which really is his experience, and how to record truth truly." Autobiographical writing saw an upswing during the early 20th century. Modernist writers, haunted by the specter of the unconscious, felt obliged to record the totality of their lives without trying to filter out the commonplace. The novelist Virginia Woolf, in a posthumously published memoir, wrote of her struggles to describe the nondescript cotton wool of experience in which moments of being were embedded. Other prose artists, James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, tried to do the same thing in their own ways. So did the writers of the innumerable memoirs and literary diaries that began to crowd novels from bookstore shelves towards the end of the 20th century. I only have time to discuss two writers of such works, Marion Milner and Thomas Merton. Around the age of 24, the English psychologist Milner decided to keep a diary in order to discover what she really wanted and what sort of experiences made her happy. With this in mind, she would note down what she did and thought and felt, and afterwards go over her notes to see if she could discover any rules about the conditions in which happiness occurred. Early on, she found the best way to proceed was to record not carefully considered aims, but just the first thing that came into her head. She had no literary ambitions. She would just let the pen run on. "Oh, I want to let go, to lose myself, my soul. What does it mean? To feel life pulsing through me, the big tide sweeping in, till I'm one with the immense surging fullness of the sea. And when it ebbs, I would be clear and cool, washed free from stinking garbage and stagnant, fetid water." Milner later worked up her diaries in the form of a memoir she called A Life of One's Own, an obvious allusion to Virginia Woolf's famous essay, A Room of One's Own. At around the same time that Milner began her secular quest, the American Thomas Merton decided to become a Catholic monk. His supervisors encouraged him to write about his religious life. The result, a memoir called Seven-Story Mountain, became an immediate bestseller. Meanwhile, Merton was keeping a diary that shows the depth of his voyage of self-inquiry. One passage of 1956 begins, "The time has probably come to go back on all I have said about one's real self, etc., etc., and show that there is, after all, no hidden, mysterious real self, other than, or hiding behind, the self that one is. The real self is not an object. However, the empirical self is not to be taken as fully real either. Here is where the illusion begins. Before the 1980s, the term memoirs, in the plural, was generally reserved for an account of a historical figure or period by someone with direct knowledge of the facts. One of the first to apply memoir in the singular to an incomplete autobiographical work was the American writer Tobias Wolff, whose This Boy's Life, a memoir, was published in 1989. Since then, memoirs have become one of the top literary genres, while many novelists write what critics call autofiction, in which the borderline between novel and memoir or autobiography is erased. First-person works are records of self-existence, but also instruments of self-creation. What French philosopher Michel Foucault calls technologies of the self. Writing in the first person helps us create the selves we become. Foucault focused on the development of such techniques in classical Greece and the early Roman Empire, but he also looked at the 17th century, where the methods of the Stoics and early Christians were taken up in a different context by the so-called human sciences in order to use them without renunciation of the self, but to constitute positively a new self. His aim was to explore the relationship between the idea of the self prevailing in a given era and the technologies of self practiced in that era, because he believed that the self is nothing else than the historical correlation of the technology built in our history. We see that over the last 2 millennia, the prevailing idea of the self has changed from a ghostly spirit to a substantial soul, to an autonomous individual, to a center of expression, to a fiction constructed by social or biological forces. The techniques of self-cultivation have changed from ritual to religious austerities, to written reflections, to scientific experimentation, as transmitted by oral tradition, handwritten text, printed literature, and finally, online journals. The self in the age of the internet. In 1928, French poet and essayist Paul Valéry wrote that for the last 20 years, neither matter nor space nor time has been what it was from time immemorial. The incredible growth of technology made it certain that profound changes are impending. One of his predictions was eerily on the mark. Just as water, gas, and electricity are brought into our houses from far off to satisfy our needs in response to a minimal effort, so we shall be supplied with visual or auditory images, which will appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand, hardly more than a sign. This must have seemed over the top in the age of the gramophone and black and white photography. 75 years later, it is a matter of daily experience. Building on Valéry's ideas, German critic Walter Benjamin wrote in The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction that the greatly increased mass of participants has produced a change in the mode of participation. For one thing, the distinction between author and public had begun to lose its sharpness, with readers becoming writers at the drop of a hat. The result has been a blurring of the line between the user's actual identity and his or her online avatar, together with an undermining of traditional ideas about responsibility and privacy. Today, users of Facebook and Twitter expressed surprise that anything said or done online should have reproductions out in the real world. Internet-based technologies are now moving so fast that, according to the authors of a recent survey, people 2, 3, or 4 years apart are having completely different experiences with technology. College students scratch their heads at what their high school siblings are doing, and they scratch their heads at their younger siblings. It has sped up generational differences. This evolving relationship with technological devices has become grist for the academic mill. There is no more reason to favor use of brain-only cognitive strategy than to favor combinations of brain, body, and world, wrote philosopher Andy Clark. Brains play a major role, of course, but one can't forget the various task-related bursts of energy taking place in muscles and organs and even outside the physical body, in the iPhones, laptops, and organizers, which transform and extend the reach of their biological processing. There's, of course, nothing new in using handheld devices to extend the range of our bodies and minds. We've been scratching and painting and inscribing marks and lines and letters on stones and walls and papers for tens of thousands of years. Most of this work has been done to facilitate the business of life, recording the delivery of a bushel of grain or marketing a new microprocessor. But some of us have grabbed whatever tool came to hand and used it to express or create ourselves.